this week's Bronx Agoge. So this week's Bronx Agoge I call the Migraine of Martyrdom. The Migraine of Martyrdom. It was 1983. My family and I lived on Marion Avenue and Bedford Park Boulevard in the Bronx. And it was the summer. I was 8 years old. My brother, 6. This particular summer, we went, my brother and I were very excited about it too, to a day camp, a very popular day camp. The majority of its popularity coming from their very successful marketing campaign and commercials. Those of you in the New York area during the 80s will remember this camp. It went by the name of Young People's Day Camp. Its logo was a smiling yellow balloon that turned into a sun in the commercial. Everybody loved Young People's Day Camp. They had a very catchy, popular jingle in their commercials, and it was the place to go. To the camp, my brother and I went. One of the things I will give my parents, amongst many things, credit for is sacrificing financially to make sure my brother and I tried to get the most cultured and varied experiences they could afford. Even a few years sending us to Canada, to sleepaway camp. Well, this particular year, there was going to be no Canada. There was going to be a bus that would pick me up a block away from my school, a block away from the apartment building every morning, and every afternoon drop me off a block away also. That became relevant on this particular day that I'm recalling, when at camp there was a young boy, probably a year or two older than I was, 10, named Carlos. Carlos was probably what we would call today as being on the spectrum. Back then in 83, we would call him a little weird. But he was older than us, but was still in our group. So I think it was probably a social assessment that had the camp administrators put him in a group with kids 2 years younger than he was. But the way it worked out and functioned was that he was bigger than everybody. He didn't really have the tools to navigate the social nuances of group dynamics amongst 8-year-olds. And what would wind up doing every day is physically either intimidate or, actually attack the people in our group to gain some sort of status. Well, even as young as 8 years old, I was not about that life. So this one particular day, Carlos, I guess having made the rounds over the first few weeks of camp, eventually got to me and I guess wanted to figure out what I was going to be about and really wanted me to fall into line like everybody else had. I wasn't interested in participating in his plan. So when challenging me to a fight, I, aggressive, stubborn, mildly athletic, but really not trained to fight at that point, was completely willing and did the whole corny, put my hands up, if you want to fight, let's fight, I'm not scared of you. And everybody loved that I was going to be the guy that stood up to Carlos, the bully. Well, Carlos had another plan. I guess he didn't know how to fight either. But he didn't want to leave it to chance. And wound up getting a pipe. Now, where we were in camp, that a pipe was within reach of a 10-year-old, I don't know. But what I do know is that it went from him challenging me physically to him challenging me physically with a pipe in his hand. And I remember there being that one moment where it was like, okay, do I kowtow and probably use my brain and say, you know what? Don't want to get hit with that pipe. Let me tell him what he wants to hear. I chose the other option, which was doubling down and telling him, fuck you, you won't hit me with that pipe. To which he responded by swinging with all of his might the pipe into the side of my head. So this is the only time in my life that I recall hearing that high-pitched monotone ringing beep in my head, knowing that there was nothing making that sound, knowing that I probably got hit that hard. I wanted to retaliate, but I couldn't see straight. Heard that ringing. I remember a bunch of counselors rushing in to my aid. I guess fortunate for me, Carlos had just hit me once. He didn't continue to hit me, but I just remember a whole big crowd and everybody going crazy. My head had swelled up and a huge cut was in my head and there was blood everywhere. I wound up being brought to the emergency room. Got a bunch of stitches, had a bunch of swelling, and this was to be my last day in camp, not because of this event, but because of what had happened afterward. I had gotten out of the emergency room early enough that I reported back to the camp and was on the bus to be brought home. Not only were my parents not notified of this incident, but I was also dropped off the same block away from my house that I had been picked up and dropped off every day prior to that, which I found out was against their policy. They were supposed to drop and pick me up right in front of my building, but it was more convenient for the bus driver, so-and-so. So that whole thing happens. My mother loses her shit. She, cursing out, this, that, the other thing. It wasn't until the beginning of the next school year that I found out what actually happened that day from a classmate who also happened to be going to that camp with me. He said, don't you remember what happened? And I didn't. Apparently, I was not only hailed as a hero who stood up to Carlos, but after he hit me with the pipe, in the blur of having gotten hit in the head, I didn't realize that everybody in my group jumped him.
That's awesome.
And he got taken out of the camp because they broke his arm. One of the kids was hitting him with the pipe after he hit me. So what did I learn from this? I learned that sometimes there's a price to pay for sticking by your principles. But luckily, in that same first lesson of that, I also learned that sometimes it works out. And that is the migraine of martyrdom.